Welcome to part 2 of Escape the Illagers behind the scenes, and in this part we're going to talk about how I simulated the marble, how I did the track design, and how I did some of the character animation. Plus we're going to talk about the lighting, music and sound effects, and then how I wrapped it all up. So with all that said, let's get started. So to start with, I got an Illager and I put him into a lovely little sleeping position with some Zeds above his head, of course, and then added a crossbow and dropped it onto a pressure plate. Now what this acts as now is a great starting point for where I should start the simulation. So with that out of the way, I needed to get the track design into place. So I knocked a couple of polygons out and I stuck a couple of bits of track in, and what you see now on screen is what I ended up going with. But I was originally actually going to go down to the right hand side, so like a little bit of a ramp down the right and then round the outside of the outpost, but for some reason I decided that wasn't the best thing to do, and instead I went with what you can see now on screen. I think in some ways I was thinking maybe he was having like a little look at the Illager before he went off on his little escape route. For this next section, I really like the idea of the track working its way through the support columns and then down onto that weird little trapdoor shelf that I'd made, and that all worked perfectly fine. And then I added some Illagers looking out so that they couldn't see the marble. I then just continued the same idea of having the track work its way through the internal structure and then went on to the next section. I continued adding some track, simulating the marble, but at this point it required the characters to actually animate with it. But what I actually did is simulate the ball first and then put the characters into place and just had them react at the correct time. Animating these characters was kind of fun. It was nice to knock the Illagers onto the front and onto their back, and also that other Illager there that's jumping up and down in anger was quite fun to do. Also, if you notice right at the end, the barman actually sort of tipped his head over to the side like, what just happened? I thought that was quite a fun bit. And here I've got a zoomed out view of the area that we've just talked about, the outpost and the bar area. You also get to see behind where there's a couple of textures that I haven't actually sorted out on the bushes, and you can see that because there's some big white planes. It's on a, I'm not sure what it's on some sort of bush and dandelion as well, I think. So luckily I don't think we see that through the animation. For the bridge section, I actually had the marble rolling over the top of it at first, but as I came to simulate the ball, I realised that it probably doesn't have enough momentum to get it over there. So instead I opted to build the track down the side and underneath the waterfall, which is actually a much more creative and interesting approach, I think, to it. And also it acts as a lovely little hiding spot for the marble to stay away from all those arrows that are being shot at it. For the training ground section, I firstly built all the track, I put that into place. But then when I started doing the character animation, I realised that the Vindicator couldn't actually catch up with the marble if it went down the second set of stairs. So instead, and it worked in my favour this, because it was a nice change in pace, is I had the marble roll down past the stairs and then come back into them, and that allowed the Vindicator to catch up, and like I said, it also created a nice variation in pace. Then as it rolled towards the tree, I always knew that the track was going to go inside the tree and then pop out the other side. And here is another zoomed out view so that you can see how everything's looking at this point. It's all looking really nice. There is something that I wish I'd done different here, and it's to do with the bit of track that is coming out of the tree. Throughout the animation up until this point, I've tried to embed the track either within the structure or within the landscape. And this is one of the few points where it isn't, and it looks very much like a marble track. I can't remember why I chose to do this, but every time I look at it, I wish I'd embedded it into the landscape much better. Looking at the design from this point of view, you can see that the Vindicator that's shaking his axe over the top of the fence could quite easily go down the steps and catch back up with the marble, but I kept the camera tight so that you couldn't see the steps going down the other side, because I really wanted to get rid of the Vindicator at this point and sort of remove him from the animation so that we could get on to the next section. Moving on to the Ravager pen, this area was a little bit tricky to get correct, as the momentum of the marble throughout this section will be lost because it's quite a flat part. So once I'd built a little bit of the track, and made sure that the Ravager could keep up with the simulation of the marble. I then built some more track in and added a piston in, because I realised at that point that's where the pace of the marble needed to be increased. And then from that point I realised that I could just about twist the Ravager to a point where it looked like the marble was going underneath its legs, and then the marble made an exit out of the gate. In the previous section I talked about how I had the track above ground, and I've done exactly the same thing here. And again, I'm not entirely sure why I did it, but I always look at this and wish that I'd put the track into the ground to make it look like it's part of it, rather than being a quite obvious bit of track. Moving on to the next section, there were a couple of choices that I had in mind. I did consider sending the marble behind the waterfall and then round the back of the evokers that are around that cauldron, but I did have concerns that the track would get a little bit too low too quickly and I'd have to ultimately end the marble run a little bit quicker. I also considered having the marble go behind the evoker on the balcony and somehow sneak over into the door that's on the right hand side. However, that all felt a little bit messy and it felt like the structure of the university was going to get in the way. So ultimately what I ended up doing is having the marble sneak under the evoker on the balcony, again pulling it into the structure of the building, which I quite like, and then having the marble travel down that long ramp being chased by fangs, which I thought worked really nicely. Then for the last section, I simply had the marble run over those trapdoors underneath the dock, then I had a little bit of track to get it into the boat. There's two little things I have an issue with here, and they're only really small. The first one is the texture on the track. If you see the very last piece of track, the texture is horizontal rather than flowing with the track. A little bit annoying. And the last one, and I have no idea how I missed this, the boat's texture is really dark. I think it's because the polygons are flipped inside out, but by the time I'd noticed, I'd already uploaded it to YouTube. And here's another zoomed out view of the area so you can see the extent of what was created, and it all looks quite nice. Adding the lighting into this animation was reasonably straightforward. I simply put a sunlight in there, chose the direction, and that was pretty much it. Aside from the only other bits that were lit up were in the university, where there were some redstone torches to just light up the areas that were quite dark. I did look at having the lighting coming from the other side, but what ended up happening is a lot of the animation felt like it was quite dark because it was in shadow. I've also used global illumination to have a more realistic feel to the lighting, and I've also applied ambient occlusion as well, just to add that final little touch to the lighting. When it came to the camera work, I really wanted to keep the camera moving all the time, although there were a couple of places where I did need to stop it. Where possible, I would at least keep the camera moving slowly, and this was all to just give that sense of excitement and pace to the animation. With the composition, what I try to do is keep the marble 1/3 away from the back of the shot. And what I mean by that is that if the marble is moving in a vertical way, if it's moving down, I try to keep the marble somewhere near the top so that the viewer can actually see what is coming next. Now, if the marble is moving to the right hand side, I keep the marble a little bit more to the left, again, so that you can see sort of what's coming. And I think this is a really nice thing to do, because the last thing you want is lots of stuff quickly rushing onto screen and not being able to see where the marble was going. Something that you may have noticed is that I keep my camera lens quite narrow, and this is quite intentional because the idea is that I'm trying to create this small world look to it, which I quite like. This also gives me the opportunity to play about with some depth of field a little bit more than I would normally with a wide angle lens. In this animation I don't get much opportunity to do it, but you see that it's strongest when it's at the start of the animation, where the background is quite noticeably blurred out and it allows us to focus on the action in the foreground. Once I'd rendered out all the images, I brought them into post-production, and then I found a nice little bit of music that I felt fitted the tone and the fun nature of how I wanted this animation to feel. I then went all the way through and applied some sound effects. Here's a little sample of one of the areas without the music. And then I added a title, and then added my standard outro. The length of the animation is actually quite short. I was hoping it was actually going to be a little bit longer, because I tend to aim for somewhere around the 3-minute mark. I feel the 3-minute mark is just about enough time for a marble run animation. And that brings everything to an end. So I hope you enjoyed this 2-part behind the scenes of how I made Escape the Illagers. If you have anything that you really liked me talking about, let me know in the comments. Equally, if there was anything you want me to talk about further in future videos, please do let me know. If you like this video, please go and give it a like, and if you haven't subscribed already, please go subscribe. And also don't forget to give it some hype if it's still within that 7-day period. Also don't forget to visit my store where I've got a few nice designs on there, and every time I release a new Marble Run video, my intention is to create a new t-shirt or a new hoodie on there for people to purchase. So again, thank you for watching this video, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.